You're listening to Power Athlete Radio, a podcast dedicated to empowering your performance every damn day. Join former NFL pro and Power Athlete founder John Welborn as he dissects the greatest minds in strength, conditioning, and more. So whether your goal is to be the hammer, destroy mediocrity, or simply move the dirt, you've come to the right place. Now with the warm-up done, let the gains begin.
Hey, Power Athlete Nation. If you follow this podcast for any length of time, you know I'm obsessed with human performance, and you know that I'm into improving brain function and, more importantly, increasing neuroplasticity. So we got a banger today with Dr. Erik Won, who's president and chief medical officer of Wave Neuroscience, a biotech company that's developing innovative solutions for mental disorders and how to improve upon your brain function. Dr. Won isn't just a pretty face. He served as a U.S. Navy flight surgeon for the Marine Medium Helicopter Squadron 268 and became chief technical officer of medical at Boeing, which is a Fortune 500 company, and served as nearly a decade under that capacity before joining Wave Neuroscience. He holds an MBA from USC and also an MPH from Harvard, and we have an interesting connection. So 10 years ago, the company that Dr. Won works for, Wave Neuroscience, was doing some brain scans that I was associated with in 2013 for a DoD study. Fast forward 10 years, I meet Dr. Won through Nick Harderwick at a South by Southwest event and end up getting rescanned. So we're going to go into these two scans and these two pieces of technology that are 10 years apart. And I'm going to get into some of the strategies I used to effectively de-age my brain, make myself smarter, and make my brain more efficient. So if you're into this type of stuff, as I know you are because you've gotten this far, buckle up and get ready for Dr. Erik Won. Man, I've been buzzing since we had an opportunity to not only kind of like hear the presentation, but also get that rescan, and then obviously wear the Sonal. I mean, you call it the Sonal system or the Sonal helmet. Is that?
Yeah.
Is there like is there like an official name for it?
That's the official name. It was researched as synchronized transcranial magnetic stimulation, but Sonal is the 5 letters in the middle of personalization. That's what the marketing people decided to go with. So, that's what we've been calling it. And I know we exchanged some text messages, and you're still in the assessment stages of, is this helping me sleep better?
Yeah.
And so I'd be fascinated to hear sort of what your experience and outcomes have been.
Well, for a while, I was super proactive, as we discussed, in terms of trying to fix whatever neurological issues I might have developed, as a result of playing in the NFL. I mean, as much as the NFL likes to downplay it in this, I mean, taking repeated blows to the head over the course of a decade is going to elicit at least some response. Hopefully it's not completely negative, but for the most part, it's not healthy. I mean, chronically beating your head into another individual 70 times every Sunday and hundreds of times during the week over the course of a decade, and then college football, high school football, I mean, has to pay a toll. And I don't think anybody, at least me, like I never made any illusions that like somehow playing football was going to improve my brain health. I kind of looked at it like at some point you just got to kind of set your body on the funeral pyre of football and set it ablaze. But I've also believed that if you're proactive, intelligent, and curious enough, that you can effectively fix a lot of these issues if you put the effort forth and remove, obviously, the contributing factors. Like you remove the contact, drugs, alcohol, poor diet, lack of exercise, poor sleep. I mean, all these contributing factors. I mean, I've met people that I haven't met them, but I mean, there's been cases of people that didn't play pro football that had Alzheimer's and dementia in their 40s. And when you look at like the contributing factors for those individuals, it's always lifestyle. It's poor sleep, it's drugs, it's alcohol, it's all these other factors that don't even equate into football. And then when I retired from the NFL, I was in Dr. R.E.M study, as we discussed, and they put me into this kind of support group with other NFL players. And it was the worst pity party I've ever been to. It was poor me, and the NFL didn't tell me this. And it was, that was the single most upsetting thing about retiring, was going and seeing like the condition and the attitude and the mindset of all these ex-players, to the point where I went once and never went back. And I was like, I don't need that negativity in my life. I don't want to be around it. I think that level of negativity, and especially like that level of hopelessness and just like, oh, poor me, I was screwed, just becomes infectious. And next thing you know, you're right there with them in the pity party. And I've never looked at it. Like, I made the decision to play football when I retired, and then it became incumbent upon me to fix whatever damage, whether it be physical within the brain or emotional, whatever it looks like. And that was like a huge wake up call for me, being like, holy shit. Like, if these are the guys you hang out with and this is your circle and these are the people you're around, all this is going to do is just create this snowball effect. And then you're going to be, 60 years old, mad at the world because, somehow you were duped into playing this amazing game. So I took the exact opposite turn and started looking at, okay, how do I fix this? And the first one was ketogenic diet. Matt Lalonde, who's my buddy, who's a researcher at Harvard, he sent me like a ton of research on like, we'll start with ketogenic diets and we'll start kind of moving through, creatine obviously being a neuroprotectant. I mean, all the things that I did have kind of moved down this like skill acquisition and exercise and metabolic flexibility, diet, nutrition. The one that I kind of stuck my head in a little bit on was the sleep aspect. Like, we know sleep is restorative and there's all these things, but to really get in and manage your sleep and fix it, like, that's something else.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And I'm not sure if we were jumping in already. I saw that we started recording.
Yeah, no. So what we do is I'll usually record like an intro for you, and let people know who you are, just because I find that if we just start talking, it just ends up being a better podcast. Yeah. No, because there's so much you touched on that I think is worth really digging in on. And the first is there's starting to be a realization, and the science and the evidence are really showing us that it's not just these big concussive events that can set us back. And I think most of us think about the knockout events where you black out and you may not remember things for a few days, but even the subconcussive events, these practices where you're making head-to-head contact and not like, I butt my head against a shelf type thing, but NFL play, I mean, you guys are so big, and the strength and velocity with which the contact is being made, just the practices, there's cumulative effects that can start to mount. And the closest proxy I can think of, there's some wonderful research being done in the military. Uniformed Services University is assessing with pretty exquisite detail the types of injuries that are being sustained based on PSI and distance from overpressurization blast injuries. And they can see these physiological changes and responses that happen by the minute. And so I think there's now a growing understanding, and we don't know what the exact threshold is. There's a lot of variables that are involved. But and talk to people like yourself and Nick, I suspect from the high school days, when you're really trying to create an advantage on the field and you're moving quickly, these subconcussive events over years and decades almost undoubtedly are having some kind of impact on long-term cognitive function. Yeah. As I kind of was prepping for this podcast, I was kind of thinking like, okay, like what was the first moment that I noticed that something like was a little different in terms of playing football? And it wasn't necessarily in high school. It was actually the first time I played in an all-star game in high school. So I got invited to go play in the Shrine game. And to that point, I was always bigger and stronger than everybody. So I always felt like, mass times velocity kind of a deal, where if I was bigger and stronger and moved, there we go. Hold on a second.
Yep.
Let me see if that's me. Okay. Yeah, I think I stepped on the cord.
You got a great background.
Oh, yeah. No, this is, we actually have the real deal here. If you're ever in Austin, man, we got to do one in person.
Yeah, I would love that.
But as I was thinking back, I'm like, all right, what was the first time I remembered like feeling concussed or kind of outside the normal? And through high school, I was always bigger and stronger and had this theory that as long as I was moving faster and bigger and stronger than everybody else, the damage would be minimum. And, those people would catch the brunt. Now, for the most part, I was right. I got invited to play in the California All-Star game called the Shrine game. And it was the first time, I got to consistently play against really high-end big players. You might have one or two dudes on a team who was pretty big, but like for the most part, it'd be like just kind of the outlier. Now all of a sudden I'm going into practice and everybody's my size. Everybody's going to college. Everybody's a Division I player. And when we get to the Shrine game, I think I was playing right guard. Yeah, I was playing right guard. I go to pull and they had a trap play, like a long counter. And this defensive end who was, I want to say he was like black and Samoan, which meant he was like hard as nails, basically took a step and ran down the line and we hit head to head. And I was at that point kind of out on my feet. I mean, for the most part, like I was super dazed and like we kind of like shook head, like we hit and we both stopped and we both kind of like looked at each other like, yeah, yeah. And like I saw him kind of stumble back and I stumbled back, ended up finishing the game. And then that night when I went home, I had some concussion symptoms where like I couldn't sleep. I felt like I was going to throw up. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw lights. And my dad ended up sitting with me the whole night and just kind of like made sure I was awake. And, when I fall asleep, he kept checking me and he was pretty nervous. And then the next day I got up and, everything was fine, or so I thought. And then obviously I went to college and played and didn't really notice anything. And then my freshman year, I was playing scout team. I got into this huge bench clearing brawl and this dude ripped my helmet off and another dude hit me with the helmet in the head. So he ripped off my helmet. I was fighting this guy, Andy Jacobs, the defensive line, Reagan Upshaw and Dwayne Clemens, who were all first round draft picks, like jumped me. My helmet comes off and they hit me in the head with the helmet. And I ended up kind of like taking the blow, fighting my way out and pretty much fought all these dudes. And I remember my football coach, my offensive line coach, Tom Cable, we watched the fight in meetings. And he like motherfucked and punished all the guys on my offensive line that I was playing with because they didn't jump in the fight. It was me against all these dudes. They ripped my helmet off and I take a blow to the head. And I noticed after that event, like something was a little different. And then obviously you go and it kind of goes away and you come back and play. And then I think it was my sophomore or junior year, I was playing left guard and we had a play which was a little outside, kind of like I blocked down. And no, I'm sorry, I was playing left tackle. I blocked down and the guard pulls around. And so we used to do something called a reverse hip block where you throw your head in front and then throw your back legs and try to roll the guy up. It's kind of a dirty move, but it's how we were taught to do it. So not realizing that the guy had his most defensive linemen, when they play on the right, will always play with their right foot back because they want the outside foot to be able to be free. So they'll play with their inside leg down. So what we would do is we would throw our head in front, try to get that inside knee and then roll him up. This guy, for some reason, when he got into a stance, his outside leg was down and his inside knee was back. So when I threw my head in front, he stepped forward with his knee and kneed me right in the forehead. And pretty much I was unconscious. But I got up, went back to the huddle, and proceeded to play like 2 more series, not knowing who I was, where I was, but yet I remembered the plays, ended up coming off, and the coach was like talking to us. And I remember I just took my helmet off and just walked away. And he was like, what the shit? And they came over and I was like, what did we have for breakfast, kind of a deal? And then they just kind of were like, hey, we're going to send somebody else in. And they just hid my helmet. And I just kind of hung out there. And so that was a big issue. And then I didn't have anything, and then I really thought about like, okay, if these 3 episodes had happened over maybe 4 or 5 years, what do I have to do to like prepare myself? And I ended up reading an article, or I remember I talked to somebody that talked about neck strength and trap strength being like buttresses and shock absorbers for the head. So at that point, I started putting a ton of effort into like the traps in the neck and a lot of just heavy pulls to try to develop the upper trap. And that ended up being pretty good. And, I never really had any major concussion, like single kind of deals in the NFL. But then all of a sudden you retire and get into the Amen study and he gets a scan. And then when I obviously met Dr. Jin through, the DOD deal with the SEALs, then the scan kind of confirmed what Dr. Amen had seen, which was the damage there on the left side of my brain.
Yeah. And you were mentioning that some of the just technique and the tactics leads to sort of repeated hits in the same area. And it's kind of an unfortunate byproduct of the profession. But yeah, those types of things the electrophysiologic function of the brain can change over time with sort of repeated hits. But I do think what you're saying, there is increasing evidence of the truth and wisdom that not having the pity party and just giving up, there are certainly things we can do to improve function and to optimize what we have. And we can kind of go into sleep and recovery and some of these other things. But the one piece that I thought was really interesting recently, there's a researcher out of Berkeley, his name is George Brooks, who's spent most of his career studying what's called the lactate shuttle. And in the blood-brain barrier, most of us think of lactate as a negative metabolic byproduct of working out really hard. We get this lactic acid burn.
Well,
it turns out
that
it's
is
actually a preferred fuel.
Well, I was going to say that is if your physiology and research ended about 10 or 15 years ago, because the present research, which is lactate is a fuel.
Yeah, it's actually a preferred fuel for the brain. Well, it's interesting. There are people now that are using these blood flow restriction devices to increase the amount of lactate pulse that you can get. So if you put them around your legs and do some squats, you can increase the amount of circulating lactate. And the evidence, George Brooks's works and others, is showing that with increased lactate, you increase the amount of vascular endothelial growth factor, VEGF, and brain-derived neurotrophic factor to both increase the vasculature in the blood-brain barrier. And there appears to be some amount of repair, which is really interesting from a TBI and concussion perspective.
Yeah.
Because the permeability of the blood-brain barrier appears to be one of the pathologic factors that can lead to decline in cognitive function. And so I think as we're starting to learn more about root cause mechanisms and the neurobiology that may lead to some decreased function, we can then start thinking about interventions that may help naturally. Like, we're not even talking about pharmaceutical interventions or brain stimulation, these other things. These are things that can happen through just diligent exercise and nutrition, monitoring the type of fuels that we put into our body. And so I think while we don't have a dedicated, here's a silver bullet, I think there are things we can do behaviorally to protect ourselves and to make sure we're optimizing the function that we have.
We interrupt this episode with a shameless self-promotion. Let me introduce you to our Holistic Athlete Movement Readiness Program, also known as HAMMER. Created after working extensively with Naval Special Warfare, the U.S. Army, Marines, and first responders. HAMMER is battle-tested training sharpened at the highest level, delivering when it counts. If you're a warfighter, door kicker, or first responder, head to powerathletehq.com/HAMMER and claim your 7-day free trial today. Now back to the show. Years ago, Dr. Sato, who was the inventor for blood flow restriction training from Katsu Global, we had the opportunity to sit down and I had a podcast with him. The problem was the translator wasn't mic'd and the content was terrible. So we never put it out, but it was incredibly informative for me because he gave me a bunch of really cool little kind of anecdotal things that they had never really proved in the research, but he had seen over the years working in Japan. One of them was there was an anti-aging effect that he felt from, and he didn't mention lactate, but he called, all like the pooling androgens and all like the ramping up of all these different, everything from like growth hormone and like he listed like 50 things that he felt increased the cognitive ability and actually prevented aging of the brain. The other one was the effectively like the pooling of the blood, and this idea of like, blood pooling within like the veins and the arteries actually increased the elasticity and created greater like venous and arterial blood flow by creating greater elasticity in the vein and the artery walls. So they had people that had heart attacks, had arterial arteriosclerosis, brought them in, had done BFR, and they had reversed 90% of it within like 12 months. And wow. One of the factors that they found was also their cognitive ability, and the way that they kind of looked at their mental age actually decreased. So he effectively was like, not only systemically fixed all the veins and some of these other issues that they had run into with the hardening of the arteries, but it actually had done something with the blood flow of the brain.
Yeah, it's interesting. I haven't had the privilege of meeting Dr. Sato, but Stephen Munatones.
If you meet Dr. Sato, if you meet him, that all this stuff was super impressive. What was more impressive was the fact that he was probably, when I met him, in his 70s, and he was like pro bodybuilder shape. Like
Wow.
he had his shirt open and you could see his clavicle and his chest, and the dude was just like in like phenomenal shape. And I'm looking at this dude, and the whole time I'm thinking like, how old is this dude? And I think he was like 70 or 71. And the guy looked like a pro bodybuilder, like in his physically, like looked like he was in his 30s or 40s. And
Wow.
like the skin wasn't saggy. I mean, his chest and the clavicle within his shirt, like you could see his upper pec in his chest. And I was like, so as he's talking to the, obviously talking to the translator, she's talking to me, I'm looking at this dude and I'm looking at the veins in his forearms. And I'm like, there's something going on here that's because people kind of like, oh yeah. I mean, but just seeing, this was his, and he gave me the origin story and the research, and then how they had basically used it with the Japanese speed skating team and all their Olympic athletes, and kind of kept it off the radar for a number of years, and then finally brought the technology. I mean, he sent me programming. It was pretty interesting to see how he would use it, and then see how everybody else is using it, because those two, it was like I got the cheat codes, and since then we've used blood flow restriction pretty often.
Yeah. It's interesting to see. I was skeptical at first. I was hearing some of the promise with it, and then I started tracking a few mutual patients with the same Katsu folks. And in this context, it was typically military amputees or people who, there's one gentleman who had lost a bit of the motor cortex in his brain and wasn't able to move quite as well. But they were using the BFR for maintenance of lean muscle mass. And I was stunned how well it worked.
Yeah. And
so there really is, I think, good science behind it. And I'm glad to see that it's being used. I think it predominantly started being adopted and used by elite athletes, Olympians, and that type of community. But it certainly has applications in rehabilitation and injury recovery as well. And I know John Doolittle is talking about it as sort of a pre-surgical, if you're going to get a shoulder surgery or a knee surgery, using the Katsu to sort of build muscle mass so that the recovery goes better and more efficiently. And so yeah, there's all these kind of tools and techniques we can use to optimize our function recovery that are not as well known. But
so when I'd originally, just a little origin story, when I'd first heard of the Brain Research Center in Newport Beach, I was, this was probably over 10 years ago. And at the time I was working we still work a bunch with Naval Special Warfare. A bunch of the SEALs were coming up to get tested. And they would obviously go over to your place and meet with a guy, Dr. Jin, who was a kind of a predecessor of yours, or at least the first point of contact that I'd met. So after about the second or third time, they invited me to come. So I went over and kind of met the group of individuals that were doing a DOD study. What they were looking for at the time was a certain brain profile that they called operator brain, that these individuals, could, obviously what they were looking for was, hey, all these SEALs have this one specific, brain kind of snapshot. And what we can do is put all these guys through selection, and we can pre-select the individuals that have the best chance to, make it through selection based off of the brain, I think was the original way it was pitched to me. So they were doing that research. And then also when I went and met them, I was told that they were also trying to do research on professional athletes to potentially pitch it to Major League Baseball and other professional leagues. So I was in the study, and it just so happened that my brain had the brain type they were looking for. I think you called it CEO brain. At the time they called it operator or pro athlete brain or something, that there was a certain brain type. And I think what I was told was that there were actually two brothers in Major League Baseball. One had the brain profile and one didn't. One made it to the majors and one couldn't get out of like AAA. So that was kind of the interesting piece for it. I got the scan, I looked at it, and then never heard anything ever again about it until I show up. Nick Hardwick comes to South by Southwest. He hits me up and goes, hey, I'm coming to South by. I'm going to speak on this brain panel and do this presentation for these guys I worked with in San Diego. And I have a rule. You're going to laugh at this. Most professional athletes, especially ex-professional athletes, are flaky as fuck. They're just like the flakiest dudes on the planet. As you know, having probably dealt with professional athletes, they're just super flaky. Like they just don't do what they say they're going to do, whether it be, anxiety. I don't know what it is. So I have this like very real deal that if somebody asks me to come to something, I show up. I figure like you have to show up for people, and to not be flaky is like one of the hallmarks for this. So Nick reaches out and goes, hey, will you come to this deal? And I'm like, of course, I'll be there. So he gives me like 25 outs. You don't have to come if you're late. No, I'm like, hey, dude, stop giving people outs. I'll fucking be there. So I show up, and yourself and another doc, I want to say, black dude from
Vernon Williams.
Yeah. So these guys give up incredible presentation, all this. Nick gives like an incredible testimony. As I'm listening to it, I'm like, dude, I've heard this before. This looks super familiar. So I walk up after, and this is an amazing deal and this. And then I think we connected and like, oh, you're scheduled to come to the deal. And I think I asked you, I'm like, hey, does this have anything to do with this group that I did? And you were like, yeah, that's us. And, Dr. Jin is no longer associated with us. He's, gone on and probably playing golf somewhere. But like, this is the research that we did. And now you've kind of gone in this different direction with the magnets and doing, even though I know you guys are probably still doing some DOD stuff, which I think is really smart. But the next day I got a chance to go get rescanned. And because of, the internet and the fact that it's the same company, you were able to pull my scans from 10 years previous, which was pretty amazing because I don't think that you've had somebody 10 years between the distance at this point.
Yeah. It's interesting to reflect back on how much things have changed. And so, since that time, the technology and intellectual property was acquired and reconstituted as Wave Neuroscience. And so some intellectual property and patents were merged from different companies all into sort of a master company called Wave Neuroscience that happened around 2019. And that sort of empowered and enabled us to explore some different opportunities and look at things from a slightly different lens. And it's been really interesting to see. I think a lot of different vectors have aligned where we're able to partner and work with more academic institutions and advance the science in, I think, a more meaningful way, where we're now looking at scalable personalized medicine and kind of tuning what we call neuromodulation, tuning brain oscillatory function in a manner that was kind of unthinkable as recently as 10, 15, 20 years ago. And that's where, we talked about a little bit at South by Southwest that the next 5 to 10 years, I think, is going to be one of the most exciting times for kind of neuroscience and innovation. This space is really blossoming in a way that I think is going to not just for, I say affectionately, kind of the nerds and the geeks and the scientists, but I think at a consumer commercial level, we're going to start seeing some of these, this sort of laboratory research and academic research starting to turn into meaningful interventions at the ground level. And so whether that's, the science around psychedelics is really interesting and exciting. Oh, yeah. These types of neuromodulation interventions, I think, are becoming better, more personalized and individualized. There's some great work being done at Stanford and Harvard and other locations. We like to think of ourselves as leaders within that space. There's so many different ways that I think we're starting to both understand and be able to intervene on some of these types of problems that have started to emerge as longevity has increased and the human lifespan has changed, as well as sort of the exposures that we receive. I think 20 years ago, the obesity epidemic that we're experiencing didn't seem like, I don't know that people would have thought that, especially in the US, we would have this kind of issue that we're seeing now. The chronic sleep deprivation that's become really part of our society and our culture. We haven't really done a deep dive on that yet, but I think it's really becoming recognized now that that's foundational and has roots into so many different types of metabolic and cognitive issues where, insulin sensitivity is impacted by sleep, our recovery, our ability to maximize the gains from a hard workout. And importantly, with the discovery of the lymphatic system, making Netter Gardner work at University of Rochester, there's a pretty causal link now where we can identify cognitive decline and dementia And the weight of the evidence is leading us to look towards chronic sleep deprivation as one of those root cause issues. And so, yeah, I think as we start to peel back the curtain on a lot of these neurobiological functions, and as technology evolves, we're going to see more exciting interventions and kind of a new era where we can be advocates for ourselves and agents of change, where we can optimize our level of function and our longevity.
We know your health and wellness are a priority. That's why we partnered with Stay Classy Meats. They are dedicated to connecting you with the finest, responsibly raised meats on the planet. Their direct partnerships with farmers and ranchers mean they can deliver to you nationwide. They're more than a meat company. They're a network of athletes and farmers committed to superior nutrition. Stay Classy works with producers like R.C. Carter, whose regenerative agricultural practices result in beef that's packed with 75% more essential amino acids, phytonutrients, and a perfect blend of omega-3/6 ratio. Experience a difference with their 10-pound ground beef or 15-pound assorted meat subscription box, specially branded as the Stay Classy Power Athlete box. Click on the link and order today with the promo code POWERATHLETE, all one word. Join us in securing your health and food supply chain. Stay Classy Meats, superior nutrition, naturally. It's time to step up your game. Stay classy with us. There's a direct relationship between insulin sensitivity and brain health. And
yeah.
I mean, the research is, it's been established and it's been, supported and redone. And, the greatest form of insulin sensitivity relates back to metabolic flexibility, the ability to use both fat and carbohydrates as fuel sources. I did a talk for the NSCA a couple of years ago on metabolic flexibility, kind of a pet project of mine. And what was amazing is the greatest determining factor for metabolic flexibility is the amount of muscle you carry in relation to body fat. So, if you jump on the internet, you're going to get like Mark Sisson and all these guys talking about fasting and primal and all these ways is like, ways to reach metabolic flexibility. And they're not wrong, but it's a very incomplete story. When they looked at all the metabolic studies, we looked at them for everything that had to do with metabolic flexibility over the course of a decade. The one common factor was the leaner you are and the more muscle you carry in relation to body fat, the more metabolically flexible you are, regardless of how you got there. It didn't matter on diet. It didn't matter on exercise. Whatever allowed you to carry the most amount of muscle in relation to body fat, those individuals were the most metabolically flexible. So, and had the greatest form of insulin sensitivity. So muscle we know is extremely insulin sensitive, fat's extremely oxidative, and they work against each other. So the leaner you are and the more muscle you carry, the better insulin sensitivity, the more metabolically flexible you are, and the better your brain health is. So it's kind of like one of those things where, like there is no, I'm obese and fit and this and like, oh no, and we've kind of got into this deal where we don't want to point out the bad thing that, hey, if you want longevity and you want to live your healthiest life and avoid these issues and cut both cognitive and physical down the line, you're going to have to try to carry the most amount of muscle you can in relation to body fat. And like it doesn't feel overly complicated. When Matt Lalonde sent me all this research deal, ketogenic and fasting, everything always went back to insulin sensitivity as it relates to muscle. So whatever you have to do to increase insulin sensitivity, to even there was some like metformin and some other studies there where they talked about improving brain health through even using these pharmaceutical interventions.
Yeah, it's been fascinating to see the convergence of understanding how the different systems are intertwined. One of the, I think, well-deserved criticisms of current healthcare is how we tend to look at organ systems in isolation, whether it's the cardiovascular system, the neurologic system, musculoskeletal system, where really they're all fairly intimately tied together. And what you're talking about, lean muscle mass is a predictor of longevity and good health. There are very few things in science that are as well established, but it's not always well understood. If you speak to neurologists about brain function, you don't always think about, the amount of muscle mass you have serving as a metabolic sink and preserving your insulin sensitivity. An endocrinologist, I think there's now starting to emerge a growing understanding of that. Even when we talk about sort of serotonin and dopamine, that so much of that derives from gut health and we're getting new and growing understanding of the gut microbiome. All these things I think play into each other, and it's to our own detriment if we're not considering the whole person. And so if we think about these pillars, where most people think about fitness as being, the really built, all muscle, no fat,
kind of
type
body
of physique.
like bodybuilders.
Yeah, but yeah.
But those are the most unhealthy individuals I've ever encountered.
Well, it depends. I think that's an important dimension to overall health, but now there's starting to be increasing understanding. So, if we talk about nutrition and activity, exercise as being two of the foundational pillars, recovery is maybe one that doesn't get its due time. And that's where sleep resides. If we think of sleep as being the time when we recover, are we doing enough? And we can delve into sort of circadian rhythm and natural things we can do to optimize sleep quality. And I think the emerging fourth pillar is connectivity and mental wellness. And we certainly don't spend enough time talking about that. And whether or not it's right or wrong, there's still a little bit of stigma, but I think that's changing culturally. We talked previously about Navy Special Warfare. I was really pleasantly surprised and taken aback how open the community was to, for example, mindfulness, meditation, breathing. Even with marksmanship and shooting, there's a recognition that how you breathe and when you squeeze the trigger and the exhale, all that matters. And so all these things, I think, how they tie together, there's a growing body of evidence and understanding of how we can optimize function. And I think, podcasts like yours that's getting this information out. There's multiple, I think, platforms where there's emerging understanding. Diet, nutrition, while it's a controversial area, we hear about ketogenic diet, carnivore diet, and there's on the exact opposite spectrum, sort of the Ornish diet and these plant-based diets. I think the science is still emerging, but we talked about a little bit that, what works for you. And I think your unique genetic profile is what we should stick with. And I think that's another area where I think the next decade is going to reveal a lot in terms of, what are the benefits and who are the best candidates for which type of nutrition profile. And I'm certainly not savvy enough to speak in that area. I know you spent a lot of time.
Doc, how did you get here? I mean, obviously, the brain is probably like the focus of your research, but like what led you down to this path and where'd you start, and kind of like, give me just a little bit of origin story of, what, like this passion, especially because when I first was scanned, there wasn't necessarily a technology piece to like improve brain health or rebalance, the waves and like the sonal. It was just kind of like, hey, we collected this information. Fuck off. Like, like good luck, like keep doing what you're doing, or maybe it gets better, but you've taken a very proactive approach to look for different technologies and trying to put together almost, and I like to use the word holistic, but not in the hippie sense with crystals, but almost a holistic approach to looking at this, like exercise, health, sleep. And then, here's some technology pieces that we feel, are relatively easy and invasive that we can use to improve upon this stuff.
Yeah, that's a great question. When I think back to the very beginning, my time in military service, I was a Navy flight surgeon. I deployed with the Marines, and my unit had the unfortunate distinction of having some of the first casualties of Operation Iraqi Freedom. And so one of our helicopters went down, and we lost 4 brothers and 8 British SAS Special Forces. And as a byproduct of that, my mission really pivoted to taking care of, my squadron, 150 men and women that I served with. And even when I left, I remained very passionate and dedicated to helping that group. And we were doing everything we could to help, whether it's post-traumatic stress or traumatic brain injuries. I was always looking for something that could help in big and little ways, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy or medication management or different types of centers. And when I left the service, I finished up my medical training at the Harvard hospitals and ended up at the Boeing company. Most people know we build airplanes and satellites. But I was one of the chief physicians and eventually got promoted to be the chief technology officer, which is how I came across this technology. And I was very skeptical at first. I think it's one of those things where you hear about a magnet and it immediately conjures some skepticism. And so I spent about 2 to 3 years of diligence trying to understand, how is this working? How is this achieving the results that it does? And I was speaking to some of the best neurosurgeons and neurologists and PhDs in the area. And each of them kind of came to the same conclusion that there's something here. And ultimately, the litmus test for me is I sent in a few of my Marines, just try this out. Let me know what it does for you. I did have a pilot come back to me, and my first sort of trial said this was one of the most life-changing experiences that I've ever had. I couldn't sleep. I'm sleeping through the night now. My cognitive fog is cleared up, and I'm not as emotional as I was. I've got this resilience. But the more moving part for me was not the spouse saying, I got my husband back. This is the guy that I married 10 years ago. And to see this repeatable was really compelling. And they'd invited me to come on as part of the leadership team. And I initially had said no. I wanted to see more data and understand the science better. But we came to a crossroads. There was a Navy SEAL Master Chief, possibly part of the group that you had met years back, who had challenged me. And he put his finger in my chest and said, "What do you stand for, brother? You're going to take care of executives at Boeing the rest of your life, or get in the trenches and help out your brothers and sisters who are struggling." And while it upset me at the time, I reflected on it a lot. And my wife had told me, he's right. This is kind of all you think about. And if you think about the typical career of a physician, you may help, 10,000, 20,000 patients over a lifetime. Whereas if this technology does what we believe it can do, it's millions of people, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people globally. And so I jumped on board about 6 years ago. And what I found most interesting about the capability is it's non-pharmaceutical, and because it's precision guided, we don't have the same kind of side effect or adverse event profile as many types of drugs. And that this is something that you can personalize uniquely to each individual based on neuroimaging brain profile, these electrophysiologic brain maps that we get. That was really intriguing to me as well. And so it is something, everyone sort of wants to find a job that they love. This is something that I've been really passionate about. But true to this philosophy, so if we believe in medicine, the first principle is prima non nocere, first do no harm.
Sure.
We need to look at things holistically. And if people can feel better and do better doing things that are simple, whether it's protecting their sleep, using good sleep hygiene, meditation, gratitude diaries, these kind of things that we can incorporate into our day-to-day lives. I'm very much an advocate for all of those things. And so if we're dedicated in service to the patients that, we're privileged to be able to see, you can't just look at, one drug or one intervention or one technology. We sort of have to bring all the best in class modalities to the forefront and honor sort of what does each individual want to do. For some guys and gals, it's like, I don't want to do the meditation thing. It's a little too foo-foo for me. That's okay. There's many other things that we can do. And I think our role is just to provide the best science possible and let people make the most appropriate decisions for themselves. So that kind of in a nutshell is how I got here. Feel blessed to be able to advocate for a technology that we feel pretty passionately is a bit of an inflection point in how we can manage some conditions that previously we really didn't have a lot of answers for.
Yeah. Just to let people in, when I had my scan done 10 years ago, and then, after South by on that Sunday, I came in and got rescanned, the results were pretty fantastic, at least for me. You'd spend about 20 minutes going through like, hey, the second scan should look like this over 10 years. We'd expect to see the curve move this way, and this here come some of the problems that we're going to encounter. All of a sudden, you laid mine top on top, And actually my 10 years later actually moved back the other way slightly. And then the peak was actually sharper and more narrow, which ended up meaning that somehow I found a way to slightly de-age my brain over 10 years. And and it was effectively, increased output and made my brain more efficient. So in 10 years, and I'm thinking like, is this user error? Was the scan not right then? Or did we, over the course of 10 years, figure out a way to improve the quality and the age of my brain?
Yeah, it's probably worth explaining, providing some background context on.
We'll put up. I'll put up the scans.
Sure.
So in this podcast, we'll kind of do a side by side, and I'll actually put the scans. I didn't post them on social and really haven't shown them because I knew we were going to do this podcast. And I thought it would be cool to kind of put them out.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So our process as Wave Neuroscience, we sort of have a 3-step process where the first step is capturing an electrophysiologic brain image called an EEG, or an electroencephalogram. So much in the same way an electrocardiogram is an electrophysiologic picture of the heart, we can very quickly and readily capture these electrophysiologic pictures of the brain now. And what we're looking for is, what's the overall global function of the brain. There's some different metrics we can use to quantify that. And importantly, we're looking for any disruptions in different circuits that we see in the brain. And one of the key metrics that we look at is something called alpha frequency. It's a dominant rhythm which your brain encodes information. Generally, people are between 8 and 13 hertz, which means they're encoding information 8 to 13 times per second. The population average is right around 9.5, 9.8 hertz. It's interesting. You start to see certain demographics emerge with different types of brain profiles, which is what we're talking about with Navy Special Warfare. Typically, people who are very fast twitch, you see these faster processing speeds. More creative types may have slower processing speeds. There's no perfect brain. I know a lot of people come to us and say, I want the perfect brain. And there's really no perfect, right? But so in different, just to walk through a couple of different potential case studies, somebody is, their intrinsic alpha frequency is 10.8 hertz, but we see a cluster of neurons that are cycling too slow. In the prefrontal cortex, let's say the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is firing at 7 hertz, whereas we can see most of the brain is at 10.8. We can fairly predictably point to that and suggest that may manifest as a certain cluster of symptoms because this area is sort of executive function and sort of management of emotions. They may feel depressed. And we would strive to optimize that area of function. We would use an FDA-approved technology called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or a new wellness kind of portable product to stimulate those clusters of neurons to fire faster in this case. And over time, the brain does a lot of the heavy lifting for us. And, if we believe we've been engineered by Mother Nature to be healing organisms, we can see the brain, these neurons start to move back into their desired optimal level of function. And in a different scenario, if we see neurons that are firing too fast, let's say, in the back right-hand side of the brain where the visual cortex resides, if you're cycling at 28 hertz, we're going to ask those neurons, we do what's called inhibitory stimulation to ask them to fire a bit slower. And gradually over time, we can see those changes start to emerge. And so that's what we do as kind of an intervention. But what we were able to see in your case is the power of, doing other types of health behaviors. And you can speak more to it. I know we talked a lot about the ketogenic diet, and you're obviously very physically fit. But over the, next 10 years, whatever you were doing seemed to have helped quite a bit. And so it'd be interesting to hear from your perspective what may have been the most meaningful changes.
Power Athlete Nation, this episode is brought to you by 8 Sleep. Summer's in full effect and it's hot here in Texas. The only place that could be hotter is in bed with me, but the pod cover from 8 Sleep allows me to sleep cool, all the way down to 55 degrees, which I need every single degree for a restful sleep. Now, 2 killer features that I like is it's a split zone. So I can sleep at 55 degrees and my wife can sleep at a slightly warmer temperature. Over the course of the night, the bed cover actually gets warmer. So when you hit REM sleep and deep sleep, it's able to elevate temperature. And then when it's time to get up, it gets nice and warm. It pops you right out of bed without some annoying alarm. The other feature is it's a pod cover, which means that it fits over the bed. Anybody that's been in a relationship or has a significant other knows that bed shopping requires 2 people to sign off. We have a bed we like, and the pod cover fit right on top. And then for those of you guys in the performance crowd, they have a bitchin' system that tracks HRV, how long you were asleep, how long you were awake, how many times you rolled over, how many breaths, a whole bunch of information for you to fine tune. And that gets delivered to you each morning in a little report, and they have an app to manage it. I'm sold on the 8 Sleep. I think it's a great system, and I think you should check it out too. Well, I hate to say it, but it's really this podcast. So we've done this podcast over 700 episodes, 10 plus years. And what I've had an opportunity to do is connect with the smartest people on the planet and create this incredible genealogy, like having you on, has been nothing short of just fantastic. Just for the fact that we've had people on that were experts that had an area and were able to come on and just give us a firsthand account. Like we had Dr. Joe DeRudy on, who's the Navy's expert on hyperbarics. And we got into all of the details on hyperbaric chambers and how it can improve health within the brain and, longevity. So he put a protocol together and I went and I did it. We've had Tom Incledon on, I don't know if you know, Dr. Phil Yu. He's, one of our oldest friends, trained at the gym. He sits on the stem cell board and exosomes and just really all of this amazing technology that tends to look like, human regeneration. But, over the course of the years, we had, Mauro De Pasquale on, we had, the guy from the Charlie Foundation, Matt Lalonde, Rob Wolf, all these guys on nutrition and training, obviously get to go interview Dr. Sato was important, creatine. So, I'm probably the longest continuous creatine user on the planet. That's my claim to fame. Started when I was 14, 46, 47 now. So, we got 30 plus years of taking creatine, which has now come out as a neuroprotectant. I think that was an issue or, was a plus. I think the hyperbarics, the exosomes was a big deal. The ketogenics, also chasing this constant amount of exercise, building an aerobic base, lifting heavy weights. I looked at a really cool research study years ago that showed different parts of the brain get lit up under a certain percentage of 1 R.E.M. in terms of lifting weights. So the singles, doubles, and triples, when you get over 90%, activate the top frontal cortex or top of the brain. And, obviously reps that are sub 90 within 80 to 75 hit the middle, and then obviously lower reps hit deal. And I think accessing that top part of the brain has been extremely helpful. So, also removing, like we looked at brain permeability, the idea that, obviously drugs and alcohol move across the blood-brain barrier and can increase almost something that's very similar to leaky gut when all of a sudden you destroy your small intestine. I think that's also happens in the brain, especially with opiates and drug use. So, we've had guys that talk about psychedelics and, psilocybin basically creating, neuroflexibility. We've had so many people on that it's almost been this amazing research study. I have a buddy, Tom Newman, who's the head of performance at Mass General now, who's like, you've done 7 PhDs worth of work just for the fact that you've interviewed the smartest people on the planet. So I think that's just the culmination of this podcast and just implementing the things that the individuals that come on that are experts that promote have effectively resulted in this. So whenever people ask me, what did you do? I'm like, go back to number 1 and start moving forward on this podcast because we've documented it along the way. And the amount of individuals that I've played with, in the NFL, former teammates, guys I haven't played with but know, and then also military guys that have reached out to me that all have the same hopelessness. Porn addiction because I can't feel anymore, sex addiction, drugs, alcohol, depression, suicide. All these things are very, very similar in terms of for high level kind of tip of the spear military guys and NFL players. I think because it takes a certain personality type, really this type A kind of living your life out on the rails, almost slight reckless individual who's pretty intelligent to be able to do it because you can't be an idiot to do those jobs. And I think under a bunch of, whether it be, neurological or emotional damage, some of these things manifest. Years ago, I went to one of the shooting schools with the guys from SEAL Team 4, Mid-South Shooting School. And as we were walking out to the range, they were in the kill house and they set a charge and they blew the door. And I was walking by as that door got blown. And dude, the concussion that hit me was pretty big. Like, I was like, holy shit, dude. And he's like, yeah, that was a quarter load. Like, we usually double or triple or, quad that. So that was a quarter hit. And then they went back years later and they started measuring the concussion. And I think it was the PSI of the blast. And I made the joke when I was walking by and got hit with it. I'm like, yeah, that was kind of a, maybe like a Wednesday or a Thursday or like a Friday practice or Thursday practice. That wasn't like a Tuesday, fucking burn them down hit, but that was probably like a good solid hit on like a 3/4 speed day. And then I realized the amount of hits that those guys are taking in terms of that, concussion. Whereas for me, I was trying to move and, effectively create more force, more mass, move as fast as I can to effectively, be the hammer, which is one of the taglines for Power Athlete, which came from a guy named Tom Modrak. I'm a rookie and he comes over to me and goes, hey, if you want to survive this NFL deal, just remember one thing. On every play, you're either hammer or the nail. As long as you're the hammer more than the nail, you'll be fine. If you end up being the nail, you're going to be out of this motherfucker real quick. And so one of our taglines here is be the hammer, which was actually, as I taped my wrist, I used to write it right here, which said, stay low and be the hammer. And I taped that and I used to look at that before every single play with the mentality of like, I need to make somebody pay for this. I need to effectively nail some dude through the wall. And I think that mentality ended up, being maybe good or bad. I don't know. But I also felt that when I retired and went through that Amen study and saw that the damage on my brain here was in the left frontal cortex, and we get into all this stuff, the one bright light that Dr. Amen gave me was they did some cognitive intelligence testing. And as he's going through all this, and he's like, the part of your brain that's damaged, and he went through and gave me all the bad news. And I'm like, well, what's the good news? He's like, well, actually, you were the smartest dude we've ever had in the study. You were off the charts in terms of cognitive ability, IQ test, and everything that we tested, you were by far the smartest dude we had. So then he goes back and he's talking about all the negatives. I'm like, whoa. So you said I'm smart. He's like, oh yeah, no, it was off the charts. It was like, you were the smartest dude in our study. And my thing was like, well, I can build upon that. If this damage, because I've always believed that if you remove whatever's causing this and then find the right stimulus, I believe you can heal the brain. There's been this misconception that the brain is kind of gray matter and you can't heal it and what happens. But when I went back and read a bunch of like different, like just anecdotal stuff, like there was a guy, construction worker, nail gun straight into the head, went in like into his skull. Something happened, or maybe went in the back. He lost his eyesight. And then like 3 months later, a different part of his brain activated and he got his eyesight back. There was, stories of a guy getting shot in the head with a bullet and still being, having 99% of his function and improving function over time. So I really think that if you remove a lot of the damage and create a good environment and continue to have a positive outlook, I think that you can heal the brain. Like we talked about earlier, as I went to that NFL group, the amount of pity and just like negativity and just like woe is me bullshit that these NFL players had. I like left there and was like I basically went home and took a shower. Was like my deal. I like tried to like wash it off because I felt like that level of negativity. I'm like, I don't want to ever go to that. I don't want to be around those type of people. And I'll literally remove myself from the circles of these NFL players because I don't want to sit around in that. And I just kind of extricated myself, went in a different direction and thought, you know what, I'm going to be positive. I'm going to fix this thing and we're going to keep running 100 miles an hour until we do. And then all of a sudden I, re-get that scan and I'm like, holy shit, maybe it worked. And so, and then, you obviously sent me the technology with the magnetic sonal. My kids actually joke it. They think it looks like Pinky in the Brain. Because I showed them a bunch of during COVID, we watched a bunch of old cartoons, like Marvin the Martian and Pinky the Brain. And they were laughing. It's like something Pinky the Brain. You're like, Dad, are you taking over the world? And I'm like, yes, Pinky, we're taking over the world. Same thing we do every day. But, having access to these technologies and, seeing how they affect, I think the only difference is I'm very open to try anything. Like if I meet you and you said, hey, give this a try, I'm like, great, send it. I'll use it. We'll have you on the podcast and I'd love to discuss it. Whereas I think a lot of people are like, no, it won't help. And I think as long as you're open to change and open to just explore every avenue, I think that the potential is so much higher.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an important part of the formula for success is remaining open-minded, kind of avoiding cynicism, I suspect. What I think, it'd be interesting to hear your perspective that you've moved into. You mentioned you're still doing a lot of training with the NSW guys. I'm not sure how much you're allowed to talk about that, but just being around that community, and I think just other types of alphas, kind of keeps the edge sharp, I suspect. And we talk about shifting, like, I think part of the loss a lot of people experience when they leave, for example, the military, or I hear this from some elite athletes when they retire, is you sort of lose that mission and purpose and you feel a little lost. And finding that again, whether it's, I want to fix my own health, I want to start serving in a different way and helping out, these elite warriors. I think finding that calling is a really critical part. You wake up in the morning, you have to stay inspired. I think that's part of it. How much of that do you think was involved in your case, or was that just kind of a happy byproduct of your journey with the podcast?
When I got hurt in my 10th year playing for the Patriots, and as I was having knee surgery, I got a phone call from a guy owned a small fitness company at the time, a guy named Greg Glassman, started CrossFit. And he asked me if I would come work with them to help them develop their tech on how to train athletes. And I agreed. 30 days later, we launched a website that got 17,000 hits. That first day, I got like hundreds of emails about the program. And the hilarious part was I didn't really have a program. I put up a website with some workouts, and then they asked me to teach a seminar. So I had to go on the road and effectively teach a methodology that didn't really exist. I had a lot of theories about training and ideas on what I'd like to do, based off of all the individuals I trained with and what I did in the NFL, but I didn't really have a system like I have today. So I went on the road and started teaching this kind of power athlete system to the CrossFit community as CrossFit Football was the name of the seminar. I taught 36 seminars that first year. So I had to get up and present and basically work these 2-day events. 40, 50 people come in, explain to them the methodology, put them through the workouts, train them, get them up to speed, teach them programming, nutrition, all these other pieces. And I was developing it in real time. I would, get up and I would present, I would write something, I'd present it, see how it worked, come back. And over the course of a number of years, probably from 2009, and we really launched Power Athlete in 2012 and didn't really take hold till 14. I was pretty much putting out free training programs on CrossFit Football, getting all of the data points back, and then traveling the world, meeting all the people doing the training program. So any theory or any idea I had, I pushed it out. Thousands of people would do the workouts and then give me all the data points. And then I had a gym, I had training partners showing up, and we were testing stuff a few days before, a week before, pushing it out, getting all this information, and then traveling every weekend, meeting the people. And I did that for a number of years. And we did that through 2017. Power Athlete started really in 2014, and I started offering programming offline behind a paywall because I wanted to test things like EMS devices. We had almost 800 people doing a training program, and 300 of the people were actually using the EMS devices in a study. We did a ton of research on the back end, and that research ended up culminating into the Power Athlete methodology and what I understand about my training system. So at the time, kind of early 2007, 2008, when I got involved in CrossFit, a guy named Dave Castro and Andy Stumpf and all these SEALs were involved in CrossFit. So I started hanging out with them and going and shooting, and we'd go out to a place called La Posta, which was where all the students would train, and we'd go up there and shoot. So I met a lot of these students. I would talk to them about training, health, and performance. And then a lot of those guys started following the training. And all of a sudden, those young SEALs became older SEALs. And now those guys are at places like Development Group, and they still follow my training. So we've provided resources for NSW for many, many years and trained some of the best warfighters on the planet. And that kind of information resource and this constant kind of evolution in terms of developing this methodology for Power Athlete has kind of just been what I've done since I've retired from the NFL. And I really think you get to live multiple lives in the case of this lifetime. I lived this lifetime as an NFL player. I buried that individual and I reborn and, basically remade myself. and to, John Wellborn, CEO for Power Athlete, this podcast, traveling and teaching the seminars, the information. We put out training programs, 4,000 or 5,000 people a day follow different versions of Power Athlete training programs around the world. All of those data points come back. We have 150 coaches through our certification, nutrition. I mean, it's pretty amazing the amount of information that just moves. And I think creating this methodology and fixing or just establishing this, this lock and key system. I mean, it's been pretty amazing. And then being able to port it over and use it with professional athletes. We just had a big event this last weekend. End of last year, I was approached to work with these professional Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu players. And the one guy came in, they were real broken, didn't know what their future was. Over the course of the last 8 months, I've used the Power Athlete system and trained these guys. And we had a culmination this week where Victor Hugo, my athlete, ended up winning the IBJJF Worlds double gold medal. He won the Open and the Divisional. And then last month, he won the Brazilian Nationals. So the first time in history that one guy has won both double gold at Brazilian Nationals and double gold at Worlds. So, I mean, he's the best jiu-jitsu player in the gi in the world at this point today. Wow. And so when he showed up 8 months ago, his back was so bad he couldn't tie his shoes. Back squatted 165 pounds for a set of 5, L4, L5. Axial loading was an issue. Cardio was garbage. Put him into the Power Athlete system training model. And not to say we did it alone, because he has 2 incredible coaches with, Sean Diabero and Lovato, Rafael Lovato, and just some amazing, and then an incredible team around him with Arash and Philippe and these guys and Steve that he trains with. But I mean, he was pretty good. And really the only change has been the addition of Power Athlete. And he goes to being, probably one of the most dominant performances ever we got to see this weekend in Long Beach. So really taking on these young guys and mentoring them, getting them into this, putting them into the system, fixing these injuries and getting them to be the best versions of themselves has been really my focus for the last 8 months. And seeing it culminate with him on the podium twice and, basically doing something nobody had ever done was pretty good receipt for the work that we've done, the methodology and all these other pieces. But it was so much more than just training. It was mentorship. It was working with these guys, creating a friendship, supplementation, diet, rehab, and then reaching out to the smartest people I know in the world, asking them to collaborate with me to help, these kids have a future. And, a year ago, this wasn't necessarily something that was on the radar, but the amount of progress that these individuals made and the amount of time they did was nothing short of fantastic. So I think having that connection and having projects like this is really what I live for. And, it's great that we provide a ton of training programs for, everyday warriors that are, obviously maybe on the field or in the garage or wherever they are, but really being able to work with the world's best and make them better is what really gets my motor running. And then, obviously all the information that we're able to glean through the podcast and research and, relationships like yours, and then being able to provide that to people that, because people reach out to me almost hopeless. Hey, I'm having these problems. I don't know what to do. Can you help me? And I'm like, I got you. I have the most amazing resource of individuals to point you to, that if the person I kick you to can't fix you, he'll know 10 people that potentially can. And I think being able to provide that hope, because I think a lot of times with some of these issues, whether it be physical or cognitive, there's this feeling that I'm this unique snowflake and nothing's going to help me. I'll never fix this. This is, I've made my bed, now I got to sleep in it. And I don't believe that at all. And I think it just comes down to being diligent and reaching out and asking for help and being humble enough to say, hey, what, somebody out there can help me. I just got to find them. And it might not be today, but I'm not going to give up. I'm going to keep moving forward. And there has to be this constant pursuit of perfection.
No, that's brilliant. And I think all the communities you talk about, whether it's, Navy SEALs and Navy Special Warfare or Elite Jiu-Jitsu, those are communities who really don't suffer fools. And if it's working and it sticks, that's where you kind of get sort of continued utility. But I know if it's something that's not working, it's discarded fairly quickly.
Oh, yeah.
And so clearly something, you're doing a lot of things right. And it was interesting to me. We didn't even know this was happening, but a lot of those guys were really kind of quantitatively testing themselves in ways, as a doctor, my background in medicine, I view things from a certain lens. It's about kind of saving lives, stamping out disease. And they're very much more, as you are, in the human performance realm. And they would come back to me and say, hey, my shooting scores, my marksmanship scores improved by 18 points. Or, I'm able to measure my force plate data, and, my stability and my reaction times have improved by 18%. And these are things that I just wasn't thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
And concurrent to this, we were hearing from some of the people at Special Operations Command, even the physicians were telling us, while these are really important things for you to focus on, talking about us trying to get an FDA approval for different indications, at our core, they felt like this was a human performance adjunct. And in particular, they were noticing one of these incidental findings through some of our first trials was improved sleep quality. And I don't think I appreciated at that time, thinking about 6, 7, 8 years ago, how foundational that was for so many different areas of this human performance world. And when people got so excited about it, like we really started doing a deeper dive into it and looking into the different elements there. And so, part of innovating this portable product is understanding some of the reservations people may have going into a doctor's office every day. And so to be able to transport that into the comfort of somebody's home, where they can get some of the benefit, a very low energy type of platform, has been intriguing to see. And some of the early returns we're getting are very similar, where we're seeing improvements in reaction time and sleep quality. And so you touched on a little bit about the changes in sleep you've observed. And I know with children at home, it's not always easy.
Well,
but,
so this is a mistake I make in that, like, we never just make one change and then see the effect. So about the same time that I started wearing the Sonal, magnet head device, I had read James Nestor's book, Breathe. So I started taping my mouth. And I believe that the conjunction of taping my mouth, and then I also started tracking my sleep. I know that one of the things that we had discussed was doing some sleep tracking. So I got a Whoop band, and I also got an Apple Watch. So just because I was like, if we're going to, if you guys are going to send me this, I have to give you actionable data. I can't just be like, yeah, I think it works. I wanted to give you guys something concrete. So, obviously to get rescanned would be the ultimate. So I've been using these devices to measure sleep. And then what I'll do is I'll sleep with my mouth taped for about 5 days. And then I'll take like 1 or 2 days off. And then I kind of look at the HRV and like the sleep performance and really the sleep health. And the tape on the mouth was a big deal in the beginning. But I think what it did is it taught me to sleep with my mouth closed, whereas I think I'd fallen into this idea of sleeping with my mouth open. So when I don't sleep, or when I don't use the mouth tape, I don't necessarily notice a real change after 2 days. But then if I get into 3 or 4, maybe the bad habit comes back and I got to retape it. But there's a pretty noticeable difference when I don't wear the Sonal. And then I actually upped it to twice a day. So I'll use it first thing in the morning when I get up. And then I was using it in the afternoon, right around 3 or 4 if I had a little bit of time before, I took the kids to JITS or anything that we had to do training wise. I would try to hit it for at least 30 minutes twice a day. And I notice... I've even done it like at 11 o'clock at night to see if I had any issues sleeping, and I don't. So I know you discussed that, some people had some issues sleeping. I didn't notice any of that. So I didn't necessarily know, I couldn't really notice if I went from like 1 to 2 days. I noticed when I didn't do it a day, for like 1 or 2 days later, something was just kind of slightly off. But then when I use it, but I will tell you the one thing which has been pretty interesting is I try to do some like breathing and some meditations. The second time I do it in the day, I can slip in and I can get my heart rate really low really quick. So that's kind of the way I measure like the meditation. If I start breathing and all of a sudden I get my heart rate down into like the, 45, 46, 47 and the resting heart rates. So when I do it in the mornings, I can get it to like maybe 52. But then later in the day when I use it, I can get my heart rate really quickly down real low. And then that ends up making my HRV better the next day. So that's just some anecdotal stuff that I've been observing. I don't know if there's any way to quantify any of this stuff, but I definitely know that if I prep it in the morning, if I do it a second time, I know it's really easy to kind of get into that kind of like really focused, relaxed, kind of almost not let's say flow state, but just didn't get into like a really good zone. And I can kind of always test that based upon heart rate. If I can get my heart rate real low, real quick, that's like a good indicator.
That's fascinating. And have you noticed a change in the sleep quality with using your Whoop?
The one thing I'm really struggling with is I can't get more than 7 hours of total asleep. So I'll be in bed for 8 hours. And so this is hilarious. I can be in bed 9 hours and I'll have like maybe 2 hours of awake time. I can be in bed, 8 hours, and it's always right around 6:45, 6:54. It's always just sub 7 minutes. And it doesn't matter how long I sleep. I cannot get over 7 hours of total sleep. But my REM sleep and my deep sleep are always pretty good. It's always around 40, 45, 47% of my total time sleeping is in REM. But for some reason, I cannot break 7 hours of total sleep regardless. And so I started going to bed at 9 and trying to sleep 9 to 5. And so what's that, like 8 hours? And I'll still be at 6:45. I'll just have an hour and 15, hour 20 of awake time. But then when I went to bed at 10, I had less awake time, but the sleep times were very, very consistent, which I don't know if that's a issue with the technology. So that's when I went and picked up the Apple, and I'm kind of trying to run them simultaneously to see if there's an issue, or maybe it's a tech issue. But I have this theory that if I can get over 7 hours of total sleep, that might be like a big change. But for the most part, as long as I don't eat within an hour of waking and 2 hours before bed, I feel like my sleep score is much better. If I eat right before bed, my sleep score's not great. Alcohol, the other night, it was wild. I went out on Sunday night, we went out after Victor had won, and we had a whole bunch of drinks at this Brazilian place, and we went and had a whole bunch of drinks more. And I got home at like midnight, and I slept like midnight to 7. And my recovery was like the highest it's ever been. And I had the highest sleep score, which makes absolutely zero sense because I didn't take any supplements. I wasn't sleeping in my own bed. I like hadn't used the Sonal. Like it didn't make any sense. So I don't know if this is just physiological or this is a technology issue. Cause with technology, I'm looking for consistency. And then, obviously you would think I'd go to bed an hour early. I might be able to get a few minutes more of total sleep, but, I do feel that a better indicator is the REM and the deep sleep. As long as those numbers are, over 30, 40%, or say 40 to 50%, I feel like I'm doing pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah. And people have different chronotypes. 7 hours is actually not bad. And so if that is, you played around with it and tried to get it dialed in, and 7 hours is the number. It's not necessarily worth beating yourself up trying to get 8. 7 hours may be the number.
Sure.
But it was interesting with the Sonal. We have this ongoing pilot Wounded Warrior project, and we got Oura rings for a number of subjects, and we were able to see across a larger population between 20 to 25% improvement in both deep and REM sleep, which was interesting. And there's a lot of debate about Whoop and Oura ring. The quantity of sleep is pretty good at measuring the duration of time that you're asleep. But the sleep architecture, how accurately it's measuring REM and deep sleep is a bit controversial. And how they measure HRV, I think, is its own kind of controversy as well. But it's been interesting to see. I was not tracking that this could help HRV, and it appears that it might. And so since you started the Sonal, presume that sleep may have improved a bit. Has that impacted the quality of your training at all? Have you noticed any change there?
Yeah, I mean, the training volume was pretty high with over the last couple weeks. The one thing that's not happening is I'm not waking up. I think I told you my daughter was attacked by a dog. And we kind of went through this kind of big deal with her, and I was having these like weird 3 a.m. panic attacks where I used to I would wake up at like 3 a.m. with this just like awful fear, heart racing, and just like this terrible response. And I think what you saw early into my study where all that kind of junk was on the front side was from what I was dealing with. And since starting the Sonal, I'm not sure if it's the Sonal or just the fact that, maybe I've come to peace with it better. I'm not having those 3 a.m. wake ups. So that's been pretty good. So I don't know if that's maybe she's healing, I'm healing, or maybe we're just getting farther away from the freshness of it. But, that has been a big, big deal where I'm not waking up at these 3 a.m. deal. So I'm hoping that the sonal and whatever, maybe the culmination of all these things has, will fix whatever's on the front side, because, I'm sure, man, I doubt there's data for it or data for it. But I mean, I would like to think that over the course of a lifetime, poor sleep just becomes compounding. And, maybe, when I was in, I always joke that I wish I'd had my kids in my teens and my 20s, not for the fact that it would have changed my life, but for the fact that I didn't really need to sleep in my 20s. I could literally go out to 2 or 3 in the morning, sleep for a few hours, get up and go to practice and be fine. If I did that now, my whole life would be shattered. And I really noticed the sleep deprivation when we had twins. So I got twin girls. So my wife breastfed them exclusively for the first 6 months. So it was they ate every 3 hours. So I didn't sleep for any more than 45 minutes at any one shot for about the first 3 or 4 months. And that sleep deprivation was my wife and I joke about it. It was like the dark time, in Game of Thrones where they talk about winter is coming. That was the darkest time in our life, just for the fact that we were just so tired all the time and trying to work and do all these things. And my poor wife is just getting her life force sucked away by these 2 twins. So I think the culmination of just being farther away from that, the sonal, another one too, just basic like magnesium, taking some natural calm, and, Doc Parsley's, sleep remedy's been extremely helpful. So I try to take that. But then oddly enough, I didn't take it when I went on my trip and actually had some of my best sleep numbers. So it's so weird that and even the whoop said it is your sleep has been not good and you've hit none of your metrics, but for some reason your performance scores the highest it's ever been, so it even quantified me in the whoop. So I just wonder if there's limitations in the technology, and I'm like you as well with the HRV. I definitely know that the more time I can keep my resting heart rate really low, seems to be the next day my HRV is the highest. I wonder if the HRV number is kind of a culmination of heart rates. If you got it up high and you got it down low, it's kind of the culmination of maybe just, variability in how your heart rate moves through the certain day.
Yeah. Yeah. It's there's a number of topics to touch on there that are really interesting. First, I'm sorry about your daughter, and hopefully all of that is over time begins to be part of the healing journey.
Thank you.
And you touched on your wife. Is interesting. So I have 5 kids. I know after our third, my wife really struggled with her sleep, and so she went through the experience, the technology, and had a pretty profound change in her sleep quality. And so if it's worthwhile, and we can talk about it offline, but if your wife was interested in trying out the sonal, can certainly find a way to get her an EEG and get things set up. But I do wonder, there's so many different populations that are struggling with sleep, particularly, this sort of post-COVID era. I think the whole country was kind of thrown for a bit of a loop, but getting back into a normal circadian rhythm, getting outside, getting natural blue light in the morning, and doing these kind of habitually good behaviors. It's been surprisingly hard, I think, for a lot of people to get back into a rhythm. And so, if this can be a small part of that answer, it would be interesting to see what could be achieved. Because I think sleep is foundational to so many other different downrange benefits, and if not ameliorated, can turn into problems as well. And, we touched on how sleep can impact us. It's seemingly more as we age than when we're younger. Yeah, it feels like when we're younger.
Why is that? I mean, my kids can sleep 12, 14 hours. It's to the point where we go to bed, they're in bed by, 9:30, go check on them and they're asleep at 10. And if I don't wake them up, it's 11:30 right now, our time. I know my wife's gone. My son went to camp. I bet you if my daughters don't have anything, and if I went up there right now, they would be sound asleep, dead to the world. They can sleep 10, 12, 14 hours. I mean, it's almost a little upsetting. I'm so happy that they can do it, but I'm kind of jealous. I'm why is it that these kids can sleep? And then we get to this point. Is it an evolutionary deal? Is it life? Is it, I mean, it just feels, I mean, I'm stoked for him, then I'm also pissed. I'm like, God damn it, I wish I could sleep like this.
No, there's definitely physiologic changes that happen as we age and as we get older. And one of those is believed to be, having growth hormone is an important part of the formula for really good sleep when we're younger. And we lose growth hormone production as we age. That's part of it. The other part of it is our electrophysiology, our brain physiology changes just a bit as well. And there's some really groundbreaking work. I talked about this researcher, Macon Nettergaard, and she was using a technology called two-photon microscopy to look at brain function while people were sleeping. And what was discovered is during the deeper stages of sleep, REM sleep and stage 3 sleep, these what were previously thought to be just structural neurons called glial cells actually shrank in size by 20 to 50%. And when those structures diminished in size, it opened up channels which cerebral spinal fluid could rush through and essentially cleanse the brain of metabolic debris and oxidative stress that's accumulated throughout the day. And what's interesting, there's a second study that was done out of Washington University where they sleep deprived people for just one day. I don't know that they'd ethically be allowed to continue doing this study anymore based on what they found, but they lumbar punctured these people after a sleep deprivation episode. And what they found was a profound increase in the amount of two types of proteins. One was beta amyloid and one was tau protein. And if those sound familiar, those are the proteins that are associated with dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And so we think about, this is just one night of sleep deprivation. What is happening to people who have 5, 10, 15, 20 years of chronic sleep deprivation? If you have increased amounts of, amyloid beta and tau proteins, and just to give people peace of mind, like a few days or a week of sleep deprivation isn't going to cause you to get Alzheimer's disease. There's a lot more that goes into it. But when these proteins phosphorylate, they turn into what are called neurofibrillatory tangles that cumulatively over time can lead to cognitive decline. And so over years, I think that I may be one of the worst at this, we just keep working through the night, or we have a certain amount of stress and we don't sleep quite as well. Cumulatively, these things may increase our sleep debt and make it such that we're not able to sleep quite as long as we're used to. And so there's a number of factors involved. But this glial lymphatic system or glymphatic system, I think is part of this answer for why, as we get older, does our sleep change? If the function of this system diminishes gradually over time, as we are chronically sleep deprived, that can have an effect. And the other part that I think is maybe worth mentioning in terms of our earlier conversation, the great work that's being done, looking at traumatic brain injuries and concussion. And there's two main researchers, they're neuropathologists that have looked at this on the military side. His name is Daniel Pearl. He's at the Uniformed Services University, and then Ann McKee at Boston University. They've done kind of post-mortem analysis of both NFL players in Ann McKee's scenario and then military veterans in Daniel Pearl's scenario. And there's slight nuances and differences in types of the injury, but in particular, these glial cells seem to be damaged by repeated head injuries. And so the function of that system may decrease over time. And so we don't yet have an intervention for that, but it's interesting that we're starting to get to some of the root cause mechanisms that are both affecting kind of our overall global brain function, but also the system that is meant to sort of renew and sanitize the brain daily during our deep sleep.
Doc, do you think there's one of the things which has always been most confusing for me, especially with like the CT and the tau, and obviously this stuff is very near and close to me, obviously being an NFL player, seeing, reading the book, that they ended up making into a movie with Will Smith. I'm gonna totally flake on the name of the book. I remember my dad sent it to me and I read it and I was like, why'd you send me that book? It was awful to read. Just for the fact that I knew Junior Seau, and I've known a lot of these players that have really suffered from this. And what's pretty interesting is you have guys like there was that kid that showed up at the Chiefs, it was like within his second year, killed his girlfriend and showed up, committed suicide at Chiefs training facility. They sent his brain out and it was riddled with tau. They had not seen it with that level, other than maybe some like really old, like 70, 80-year-old players. But here was this, 25, 26-year-old kid that had, pretty significant. But then you run into guys, later in the years, like ex-players like me that don't have the same cognitive issues. So I like, it's either got to be environmental, it's got to be genetic, or some other factor that was accelerating this within these younger players that might not have played an issue later in life. One of the observations I made, and this is purely observational, I have no proof for this, the guys that took the most amount of painkillers when we were playing tend to have the most amount of trouble today as retired players. So I knew guys that were chewing opiates, painkillers, Vicodins, like they were breath mints, 10, 12, 14 in a day. For me, I never, I took them on a few occasions, maybe post-surgery, but never took them with any regularity and never took them post-game, especially when we were in probably the most concussed state. So I just kind of avoided it. Just anecdotally, I think that maybe the painkillers or some of the other, those kind of maybe drugs that were used to manage pain or whatnot might have a second order effect in terms of making the tau and some of the other issues. And it could be as simple as just a disrupting sleep. We had Doc Parsley on and he talked about, when they started analyzing how Ambien was really affecting the soldiers. He's like, shit, dude, this stuff should be illegal. These guys were never in REM sleep. They were just in this weird daze they were confusing for sleep, but actually did much more harm than it did help. So, I'm not asking you because I'm sure, unless you've done the research, you're not going to make a determining factor, but just observationally, it just seems very inconsistent. You would imagine that like, hey, if a guy played 10 years in the NFL, this is what his brain should look like over time, based upon a 25-year-old who commits suicide or Junior Seau or some of these other guys. But then they've also had 70 and 80-year-old players that have passed away from normal, ex-NFL players that have passed away from, normal causes, submit their brain and not have the same issues that they saw within these young guys.
Yeah. I listened to your podcast with Dr. Parsley. It was amazing. And he's a brilliant guy in his own right. So, but to your original question of why are they vulnerable to concussions and why are other people, I think, more resilient? And I think the most honest scientific answer is we don't know yet. There's a lot of risk factors that may go into it. Certainly, there may be genetic markers that may put people at risk, both, epigenetic and there may be other factors that are involved. But there is a school of thought that earlier concussions may predispose people downrange. And so while people are still kind of developing, let's say in adolescence, those types of concussions may be particularly damaging. It was interesting that some of the worst EEGs that we saw were on soccer players, from, not like the major head injuries from 300-pound linemen smashing into each other, but repeated minor subconcussive events. If they're doing 30, 40 headers at practice repeatedly, there may be some cumulative effect. But I think that's still an emerging area where it's hard to look at things longitudinally over long periods of time. And so if somebody, is having, is really struggling at what we would consider a younger age from concussions, you'd mentioned some people in their 20s and 30s, it's hard to do a retrospective analysis to figure out exactly what the risk factors are. But hopefully over time, we'll have some answers. I think you touched on one of the real neuroprotective compounds you've been taking since a young age, which is creatine. And that's been pretty well validated in the science.
Yeah.
That, even in the face of significant head injuries, creatine can be quite protective. So I think, the most honest answer right now is we don't have great fidelity on what might be the risk factors or causes of people being more susceptible than others. But to this, other point of some of the kind of really challenging and difficult stories, whether it's Junior Seau or, movie concussion, I know was a hard one to watch. those are always challenges. And I think part of the answer is being proactive and having people reach out for help earlier. It's a hard thing to acknowledge. And our hope is within the next 5, 10, 15 years, we'll start getting more in the way of interventions, but also be more preventative. And, I know this is something that is being incorporated into youth sports. A lot of the types of contact that are allowed is being mitigated and moderated in some way. But yeah, the sport is the sport. It can't be fairly violent, whether it's this or MMA or boxing. Sort of part of the landscape of these types of contact sports. And so, how we manage that and get ahead of it, I think, is part of the real key moving forward.
Could you discuss and really kind of explain the technology piece? I mean, we keep talking about this magnet helmet, and maybe we'll put a little video of me doing it into the podcast just to kind of give people an understanding, and they can go on and do a search on your website and kind of see the Sonos system. But can you get into a little bit of the technology piece? Because, what was kind of wild is, obviously my scan was very different than Nick Hardwick's. Nick's scan was kind of like, I think he was like permanently in theta brainwaves. So I know that like that was a big thing for him, which is kind of hilarious because that's kind of almost like walking around in a daze. But yet like, and I know that the helmet really helped him in terms of balancing it. So is it the technology is there, or is it adjusted on your side based upon the brain? And just kind of get into a little piece on that.
Sure. And I want to pause for a moment because I'm not sure what we're allowed to mention and not mention.
Well, he's been on the podcast and we've talked about it. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'll hit him up, but yeah, I don't think he'd have a problem with it.
All right. Yeah. So, we touched on some of the process where we get this EEG and we're looking for disruptions in neural networks. And our group is particularly focused on a circuit that's called the default mode network, which is what is your brain doing at rest in its kind of most optimal state. And it's been most closely linked with concussions, traumatic brain injuries, and PTSD. And so this is not necessarily even our research. If you look through large databases, you'll find that this DMN, the default mode network, and disruptions in this activity can lead to some of the symptoms that are quintessentially associated with some of these diagnoses. But it's really at its core just trying to optimize the function of these circuits and these networks. And so getting the EEG brain map to identify the areas of dysfunction and then personalizing the treatment protocol so that we can honor sort of the diversity of our species where, the protocol for you versus any other athlete or military veteran or operator is customized to your specific brain type and what we see in the electrophysiologic pattern. Mm-hmm. And when we go to a medical center, we can use this TMS device, and the settings can be customized, and we can geo-navigate to different areas of the brain. With the helmet, this portable unit, the Sonal, it's customized to your settings as well, but at a much lower energy level. And at a high level, what we're trying to do is restore the circuit so that global brain function starts to improve and work more efficiently, kind of as an engine. We sometimes don't think of the brain as a unique and distinct organ, but it's a pretty miraculous system. It's 86 billion neurons, each interconnected to 10,000 other neurons. And just a small cluster that may be misfiring can really manifest as some significant symptoms. And some people that may be subclinical forms of depression, we call it dysthymia, and other people that may just feel like a little bit of cognitive fog. And what we're doing with this device, we're using magnets to stimulate brain activity or provide an environment that will encourage proper neuron activity. And over time, if we're doing 30-minute sessions daily, that entrainment, similar to a muscle, you entrain a muscle over days, weeks. If we're disciplined about it, these muscles get stronger. We're providing the same kind of stimulus and environment to neurons. And over time, we can reinforce this activity, and we start seeing a lot of benefits With medical grade technology that's been FDA approved for depression. We're seeking new FDA indications for concussion and PTSD. With a wellness device, we can't make any claims along those lines. It's more for wellness purposes, but we can talk about improvements in clarity. And one of the things that we've seen fairly consistently are improvements in sleep quality. And that's one of those things that we talk about. We hear repeatedly a lot of the people who are using technology say, I'm dreaming for the first time in years, which is a sign they're getting into REM sleep, one of the restorative stages of sleep. And that has a lot of kind of second, third order benefits we talked about earlier. It's interesting. When I first started using it, I was wearing my Whoop and my Oura Ring, and I could tell I was getting higher quality sleep, but I didn't necessarily feel a difference. But my wife and my coworkers were telling me, no, you're different. Like, you're a much more patient guy. And so I was like, okay. So sometimes it's, we need these quantitative tools to really assess how we're doing. But yeah, it's been an interesting journey to see kind of how these different types of technologies can benefit people, sometimes in small ways, but in sometimes really significant and important ways.
For sleep, what's the low-hanging fruit for sleep? I mean, you talked about sleep architecture. We talked about sleep hygiene. Obviously the bed that you're sleeping in. I mean, a big thing for us has been like the cooling mat, sleep aid and, chili pad. Some of these other systems have gotten very, very good. Sleep noise. I know my wife's a huge believer in sleep noise. Like we would play, I think it was white noise for the kids when they were babies. And we ended up, just basically like the minute we hear it, we fall asleep too. So we almost trained ourselves to use it. So she's been big on that. Obviously magnesium. I'm just wondering for you, obviously there's all these sleep stuff, but then there's all other stuff on the other side of this, like you talked about direct sunlight first thing in the morning, mindfulness, maybe putting your feet on the ground and getting a little bit of grounding. I mean, it feels, one of the questionnaires on the Whoop is, cold shower. Did you get any zone 2? When did you eat last? I mean, I'm just thinking for you, if we were going to put a list of like low hanging fruit together, what would be on your list for best sleep practices?
It's a great question. And there are lots of good resources out there now. One of the sleep specialists or sleep experts I really like is Matthew Walker. He wrote a book called Why We Sleep, and he's got some excellent podcasts out there as well. But one of the things I like to talk about and really reinforce, and I think it's becoming better understood now, but blue light exposure, there were 3 Nobel Prizes awarded for some of the discovery of blue light and its sort of foundational mechanisms in terms of circadian rhythm. And for those who are not familiar, blue light is 450 to 500 nanometer light. And you think back to our Neolithic ancestors, the first biological cue to wake up was natural exposure to sunlight. And blue light is richest in the morning. And when it hits your retina, it activates a certain type of neuron called melanopsins that send a signal to your pineal gland that roughly 14 to 16 hours later, there's going to be a big spike in melatonin. And so there's 2 real keys that can help a lot of people, I think, get more restorative sleep. One is making sure they're getting unfiltered blue light in the morning. It's not always easy to do, but if we honor sort of our ancestors, get outside. You can have a bowl of cereal outside. Don't wear sunglasses, and just spend 30 minutes outside and get that natural unfiltered blue light into your eyes.
Doc, I was going to cut you off for a second, but side note on the sunglass thing, because a lot of people throw the sunglasses on immediate. Years ago, my dad got skin cancer in his face on the left side of his cheek. And the first question that the old doc asked him is, do you wear sunglasses when you drive? And my dad said, yeah. And he's like, He goes, for some reason, my clients that wear sunglasses tend to develop more skin cancer on the face.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, because his theory was that if you don't take in the natural sunlight, your body doesn't put out the protective mechanisms that can force sunlight, and people tend to get more sun damage for sunglasses or from wearing them. So I stopped wearing sunglasses. And so it's just one of those things where, like, as you were talking about this, like direct sunlight for sleep, but also, and this is purely anecdotal for this guy who was doing a bunch of skincare stuff for my dad, but just did a basic study of his clients and asked them, do you wear sunglasses when you drive? And my dad's like, yeah, of course, everybody wears sunglasses. He's like, well, it seems to be the predominant deal that the people that wear the sunglasses tend to develop or get the different melanomas and things on the face.
That's interesting. I mean, it is important for safety reasons. You don't want to, if the sun is blinding you when you're driving, you got to put on sunglasses. But I can see for the most part, if you can not wear sunglasses, that's certainly better early in the morning.
Sure.
But the other part of that would be late at night when you are having that melatonin spike. So if we follow these sort of general guidelines, we're getting blue light in the morning and following our biology. Late at night, at the first sign of nighttime somnolence, when you're having this melatonin spike, you have to get into bed fairly quickly. And many people, we try to push through that early sign of fatigue, whether it's, to put our children down or to get to that last email. But it's our biology telling us it's time to go to rest. But if we do that,
what should we do? I mean, I really wish, we tend to maybe watch some TV. I'm on the computer. Like, how do I mitigate that? Is it like those blue light emission sunglasses like seeing glasses? Are there different things that people can do to kind of mitigate that? I mean, they say like no blue light 90 minutes before bed, but I mean, a lot of times I go to bed at 9 or 10 and I'm working on the computer till 7 or 8.
Yeah. Well, there's sort of two separate topics. Like avoiding blue light at night is important as well. And so most of the devices these days, like I know at least a lot of the Apple products and iPads, they're programmed to stop emitting blue light late in the evening. And so some of that has now been programmed in. And so we do want to avoid overstimulating ourselves. And the general advice is 2 to 3 hours before we're going to go to sleep, avoid kind of really stimulating content, whether it's, don't watch Game of Thrones right before you sleep, or, try to avoid kind of an email from work that may raise your blood pressure, and just allow yourself to slowly wind down. And that can allow us to get into the proper frame of mind to sleep. Trying to avoid like bright stimulating lights is important too. A bit harder to do, but so avoiding blue light late at night, I think, is one piece to it. The other piece to it is when you do feel that melatonin spike, generally around 9:30 to 10 o'clock, getting to sleep within 30 to 40 minutes is important. And the hard part there is many times our kids are still awake, and when they're young, we want to tuck them into bed. And so navigating some of that is the challenge. Now that my kids are older, they can put themselves to sleep, and I'm able to, kind of get back into a bit of a better sleep routine. But these are kind of some of the nuances to sleep hygiene that are not so easy because day-to-day life sort of intervenes. But that has general rules and principles to follow. You touched on these earlier, avoiding kind of heavy meals or snacking after, let's call it 7 o'clock, is an important precursor to allowing yourself to get good sleep. Avoiding overly stimulating content. TVs generally don't have the blue light filter. Blue light degrades exponentially over distance, though. So as long as you're sitting far enough away, it tends to be okay. But just make sure the content is not something that may be upsetting or too scary. I know in the Dr. Parsley podcast, you'd mentioned you and your wife are very different. You can watch something horrible, watch people get cut in half, and you fall right asleep. But your wife may stay awake.
No, we have to. We can only watch like comedies or things that are like super positive, where I could literally watch Game of Thrones and fall asleep on the couch and sleep fine. Like her, anything that's like stressful or like anybody gets killed or anything in a deal, she just like lays awake and stares and just gives her anxiety. So she's like, I cannot believe you watch this garbage. And so we just and then it's funny because if she's not watching TV and it's on, I'll like see her like watching out of the corner of her eye, and I'll just have to change it. So it's just trying to survival. But for some reason, I don't know, like violence and that type of stuff just does not. I mean, maybe I've just desensitized myself so much that it just doesn't bother me. Whereas, like this weekend was pretty interesting. I was at that IBJJF Worlds, and I was never nervous playing football. So I had like nervous energy to start. And, I wanted to get out and like, just basically I didn't like standing around waiting, but I was never nervous to do it. And I was super nervous for my guys this weekend, to the point where like I was like, it was the weirdest thing, because I've never been nervous, and I was nervous for my guys to be able to go out and perform and do well. And it was just, I was like, maybe this is age. Maybe, you get to an older age where you've been through a lot and you see things and you realize the magnitude of like what these guys are about to do, and you want them to do well, because if they do well today, this effectively sets a trajectory for the next 50 years of their life. So like, you want them to seize the moment and trying to give them that perspective. I mean, when I was 23, I didn't realize what I was doing, or even up until the age I was 30, that what I did on Sunday would basically set the trajectory and be something that people would want to talk to me about for the rest of my life. So being able to explain to them the magnitude, but then also not have them be overwhelmed by it. Like, we've done the work, go out there and do well. And I'm super nervous for them to the point where I was like, I can't watch. So it was just really hysterical for me to kind of be in that situation. So I can kind of understand it a little bit. Whereas for me, like, the violence didn't upset me at all, but now my wife watches it and it upsets her. Whereas, I don't know, just an interesting observation, but really fascinating that exposure 14 to 16 hours before bed of direct sunlight results in a big melatonin spike. What happens if people don't get that exposure? Like, if they're just inside artificial blue light or artificial lights, and they don't necessarily go outside first thing in the morning and get that direct sunlight, or they throw on the sunglasses.
Yeah, I mean, nature sort of designed us where we do have an intuitive sense of circadian rhythm. Like, you can travel, to a different country, and while at first your sleep cycle is going to be very disrupted, within a week or two, you start to adapt. And so, there's naturally, like, if you stay indoors the whole time, your circadian rhythm can get very confused. And in fact, in ICU settings, there's something called sundowner syndrome, where if you're getting no exposure to blue light, you can get profoundly disrupted and even psychotic. And so it's an important part of our biology that I think is neglected. And we don't always think about it. You had asked about low-hanging fruit. And in many ways, we sort of have to lean on, look, we have 6,000 years of evolution, and we've only had about 200 years of artificial indoor sunlight. And our genetics just doesn't adapt that fast. And so we're not used to, and these indoor lights, they don't actually have a lot of blue light. And so you're not getting that exposure. And I think it's one of those hidden issues. We as a world, I would say, as a species, but particularly in the US, where we work really hard through many hours of the day, has sort of lost touch with kind of that contact with nature. And it's very hard for us to be indoor creatures when most of our history has been outdoors.
Sure. And
so minimally, if we're talking about 20 to 30 minutes outside to start out our day, that's a way to at least kind of honor sort of our biology and set us up for success later at night and trying to get good restorative sleep.
Yeah. Did you ever feel any anxiety with the different kind of sleep measuring, like Whoop and Aura, like almost like a little bit of anxiety, like, I got to go to bed, I don't want to have a bad sleep score, and you start putting undue pressure? Because we're working with these guys who are doing the Drake's Fury deal. I don't know if I didn't necessarily, I haven't talked to you about this, but there's some through Mike Sorelli and these guys have this Legacies Foundation, and the first event they did is they jumped into 7 continents in 7 days, kind of a deal, skydiving. And then the next one, these former SEALs are going to try to row from Antarctica to Chile in what's called Drake's Passage, which is like the most treacherous ocean, 645 miles in a rowboat. So 6 dudes, 3 row at a time. And this is I'm working with these guys on it, and Whoop sponsoring, so they sent us bands. And one of the things that I've been getting back from the guys that we've been training with is the kind of like a weird feeling of like a little bit of anxiety where, it's 10 o'clock. I know I got to wake up at this time. The Whoop has told me I need X amount of sleep to perform at my highest. And like this little bit of like kind of pressure where all of a sudden they go to sleep, and there's like a pressure to go to sleep and they can't necessarily relax. So I wonder if this is something that, because and as soon as they mentioned it, I'm like, oh shit, dude, I think that is a thing. I just didn't know if there was any documented kind of anxiety or pressure, if you felt it when you were using them, since you had both the Aura and this one, like, oh shit, I better get to sleep. If I have a bad score, I'm not going to have a good day. And then it's kind of this compounding deal.
Yeah, it's interesting. So personally, I haven't felt much anxiety. Like I just like the data. But I have lots of friends who won't wear it due to that kind of anxiety that it induces, and the feeling is it keeps them from sleeping because they feel some performance stress of, well, if I don't do it, it's going to put me in the red. And so the compromise, I think, many times is if you're going to do an intervention, and if you're sleeping well, there's no need to add noise to the system. If you're having good restorative sleep without wearing a device and you feel good about it and you've been able to validate it, just go. But for other people, if you're introducing some intervention, let's just say, I'm going to try taking magnesium for a few days. It's useful to know if it's helping you or not, because many times people wake up and they'll be like, did I sleep better? I don't really know. It's nice to sort of have some quantitative measure taken with a grain of salt. If the contact on the ring or the band isn't good for whatever, an hour and a half, you roll over the wrong way, there may be imperfect data. And so it's kind of longitudinally over time, these things net out and you can get a better idea of what your sleep quality is. And so, I know I'm a bit of a data junkie, so I like it, but there are plenty of people who they do get that performance stress or anxiety wearing it. And so that's, I think, the beauty of these wearables is you don't have to wear it every day, just kind of when it's necessary or needed.
Well, the one thing that seems to be universal is I see a direct correlation between my conditioning and my aerobic base, just my aerobic fitness and sleep. It's kind of a one-to-one. When I do, when I like working with the fighters, they were doing so much work on the mat. I mean, I think they had like 17 sessions a week. So they're rolling for hours. And so and when we track the heart rate, it's a lot of like zone 1, zone 2, and then it goes up to this, and it's kind of like a little all over the map. So I didn't necessarily have to train them in different kind of heart rate zones. I just had to make sure they were strong, stable, could move, good axes of rotation, transverse plane, different planes of motion. When we did conditioning, it was a lot of like really high end, zone 4 plus type of deal, like, 95, 98% kind of Tabata type stuff, because I knew that the majority of their training was going to be in these other zones. So I started kind of like, okay, a lot of, push, pull, throw, a lot of hinging, a lot of glute work, and then some upper register stuff just because, managing their training. So for these Drake's Fury guys, because, they're going to be rowing for, let's say, 90 minutes and just basically for 12 days straight, 90 minutes on, 90 minutes off, there's sleep deprivation. So I had to dig into just a lot of like just different zones of training and Joel Jameson stuff. So as I've been playing with like different intensities, like, 2 days of zone 1, 2 days of zone 2, and then 2 days of like, obviously 3, 4, and like kind of the upper registers, I noticed that when I'm more consistent in training in the zones and I can feel my aerobic base go up, and the way I test it is resting heart rate and then how long it takes me to get to the zone. So I have to like ride like a demon to try to get into zone 2. It takes me at least 6, 7, 8 minutes of hammering on like the Echo bike to be able to get my heart rate up into like the 130s. And the longer it takes me to get my heart rate up, the more fit I know I am. And I know when I'm pretty consistent 5, 6 days a week and I'm pushing the conditioning, the sleep just in quality proves just 1-to-1. So I wonder if a lot of the sleep issues and a lot of the problems we're running into just stem from a lack of physical fitness and people just not getting out and doing enough training, or the training they're doing not being enough within the different zones. Because the one thing that's been nice, the reason I got the Apple was the Whoop doesn't allow me to track heart rates on the band, and I hate looking at the phone. So I just basically ride and I'll kind of glance at the watch. So these two kind of pair together, and I'll wear like a heart rate strap, and there's some other things we do. But I definitely, when people ask me like sleep, I mean, we get into like, make sure the bed is cool, like we talked about. But the big one is like making sure you're in shape. Like it helps, not only digest food, the lymphatic system. I mean, all of these aerobic systems, all these systems are predicated on strength and a well-developed aerobic system. And I think as we age, we just, that's why the 10,000 steps deal, like the research is pretty conclusive that if you can walk between 10 and 14,000 steps a day, your chance of longevity and health are dramatically improved. And it's because of, maybe the zone 1, zone 2, just building a big aerobic base. So that's a big one I'm pushing these days. Like, you want to have better sleep, develop a more efficient aerobic system.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no question. Movement is medicine. There's almost nothing I can think of that will do more for your long-term health than getting out and being active and doing vigorous exercise. And so I think you're spot on with that observation. And, I think what these devices are doing, like, I think part of the evolution of zone training is making sure we're not overtraining and getting people into the right mindset and knowing sort of when to take a day to recover. And so I think that area of physical training has, the science has really evolved by leaps and bounds, and just impressed the types of things people are doing these days. I've seen some of my friends' kids are doing endurance training and playing sports at a pretty elite level, and what they're doing from a training perspective so much more thoughtful and quantitative than, and I'm dating myself, I'm over 50, but when we were out there, they just rolled a ball out and you would go.
Yeah.
And these days, you're really measuring sort of, you're doing zone training, you're measuring the number of steps and how much distance. So you're not overtraining these young kids, pitch counts, you name the sport, there's different ways of quantifying and measuring activity. But yeah, how that ties into sleep, I think they are intimately tied together.
So Doc, if people want to know more, or they want to get scanned, or maybe having issues with their sleep and they want to reach out and maybe employ the system, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you, and how do they get, how can they get on this track?
Yeah, so the technology company is called Wave Neuro, and it's just like it sounds, WAVENEURO.com. And then our clinics they're all owned by kind of doctors in the community, but most of them will get EEGs for you if you want to see what's kind of happening there. They're called braintreatmentcenters.com. And there's also braincareperformancecenters.com. And you can see the product offerings at those different locations. And we have Instagram and Facebook presence as well. And so you can look at our social media. But yeah, really excited and honored to be on the podcast with you, and really enjoyed the conversation. Yeah,
thanks, Doc. And when you're in Austin, let's do this in person. There's so much more rich, but I really enjoy it, and I'm super thankful, and it's just such an interesting life. The fact that here I was 10 years ago, just showing up to get some scan with some SEALs, and then all of a sudden, years later, here I am. Obviously showing up to see Nick present, and give his testimonial for the work that you guys had done, and then obviously connecting, and now this. It's makes you realize that, like, when you push out to the fringe, how close everything is. And I really at first, when I first started the magnet thing, I was like, I think I feel better. But then, like, the cumulative time of the last couple months, it's very, very noticeable. And I actually look forward to it. It's nice. I get up first thing in the morning. It's I don't even drink coffee before it. I do it first, and then I'll sit outside and drink some coffee. But I really enjoy it. And it's funny because the kids ask me, they're like, "Hey, can I try it?" And my thing has always been like, well, I think it's custom designed for my profile. So I don't know if it would give you the same effect, because maybe, that was the question I had. And they were like, "Are you sure?" Just think I'm lying to them. I'm like, no, I'm telling you, it's custom designed. I have to log into the app, and I think it's custom for me. So they've been like, well, what does it feel like? And I'm like, maybe I'll get you guys one, or I'll let you guys do it one day. But yeah, it was great to connect, and thank you so much. And if you guys want more information, you can always reach out, and we'll post some videos and some side-by-sides of my different brain scans, and we'll go from there. So thanks, Doc, for your time.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thanks for tuning in. Another episode of Power Athlete Radio.
This episode of Power Athlete Radio is powered by Train Heroic, the most immersive strength training app experience on the market.
We've built our online training business by partnering with Train Heroic and helping us deliver all of our world-class training programs like Jack Street, Field Strong, and Grindstone. To learn which Power Athlete training program best suits your goals, head to powerathletehq.com/training.
And if you're a coach looking to build a business with the best tech and training, go to trainheroic.co/powerathletehq.